While attending the Civil War Faces show in D.C., I realized that I was smack dab in the middle of where the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia crossed sabers. I mean, everywhere I drove, there would be a sign marking a Civil War battlefield. So I actually teamed up with Tyler McGraw, aka the Unfiltered Historian, to check out an untold Civil War battlefield. Talking to Tyler, we decided to visit the Slaughter Pen Farm. Why is that? Because we believe it truly fits the mold of untold Civil War. It was the high watermark of the Battle of Fredericksburg, and yet hardly anybody talks about it. Now, thanks to sponsor of the show, Civil War Trails, it was quite easy to find this battlefield. Civil War Trails is a non-profit organization that works with local communities to mark those places where Civil War history took place. The trails are numerous and can be biked, hiked, or even paddled. Today, my trip didn't involve any kayaking or mountaineering, but it was no less interesting. So let's set the stage. McClellan is relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac after President Lincoln's patience finally wears out. Lincoln turns to a man that looks every inch the Victorian-era general. General Burnside had some success during his expedition into North Carolina, but he was the first to doubt his own success at higher command. Many shared the same opinion, including General Baldy Smith.
We all thought we knew Burnside well, and while we did not think him a strong man, we knew him to be cautious and thought him amenable to advice from those he knew had his interests at heart. The result was we knew nothing of him. Of opinions he had none save for the reflection from the last person with whom he talked. With all this, there was the intense stubbornness which sometimes takes hold of weak minds.
At first, Burnside pleases Washington as he puts his army in motion towards Richmond. His route will take him across the Rappahannock River at a small Virginia town called Fredericksburg. Two problems. First, the only way to cross is with pontoon bridges. Second, the town is occupied by some of the best shots in the Confederate Army. He is able to force a crossing that was done under fire, and once on the other side, intense hand-to-hand and room-to-room fighting takes place. The Confederates ultimately fall back, and the Army of the Potomac, like many a war party before them, begin to loot the town.
The streets presented some very strange sights after our troops gained possession of the city. The soldiers began to pillage and destroy. Everything in the way of furniture was brought into the streets. Soldiers dressed in ladies' dresses, hats, and bonnets paraded through the streets. An elegant piano might be seen with a soldier drumming in on its keys, while another would be dancing on top of it. Cooking of every description was going on all night, with the furniture or pianos being used as firewood. Men who at home were modest and unassuming now seemed to be possessed with an insatiate desire to destroy everything in sight. Thomas M. Aldrich, Battery A, 1st Regiment, Rhode Island Light Artillery.
Come December 13th, the Confederate Army was entrenched just outside of town. Burnside intended to engage them. The left of his line was under the command of General William Franklin. The center, General Joseph Hooker, and the right, General Edwin V. Sumner. Our story brings us back to Franklin. Now most will know what happened further to the right. The story of Marye's Heights and the Irish Brigade is renowned, but it is almost accepted, even by those who were in it, as a suicidal endeavor. It was a charge against a stone wall. Although practically impenetrable, the soldiers were lauded for attempting to carry out their orders as good soldiers do.
That mortal men could have carried that position, before which wantonly sacrifice, defended as it was, it seems to me idle for a moment to believe. But the bodies which lie in the masses are the best evidence what manner of men they were who pressed on to death. The London Times.
However, this was not the case on the left. Long before the Irish Brigade's advance, Franklin's men had pierced the Confederate line and were about to seize the day. This was the high watermark of the battle. Franklin would have General John F. Reynolds, 1st Corps, lead the attack. The left of the line was under General Meade, and the right was under General Gibbon. You can see the land well preserved that the soldiers of the 1st Corps were expected to cross under enemy fire. The attack was described by a Union soldier.
3 times had the flag been shot down, carrying with it at each prostration the brave heart that bore it aloft. But only for a moment was it suffered to trail in the dust. Others were there to venture limb and life in maintaining it erect in sight of the foe. Before the railroad was reached, 8 of the regiment killed and 73 wounded. including the colonel and 5 other officers, marked the ground over which we had passed. Through the ranks of the 3rd Brigade came Colonel Lyle at the head of the 2nd Brigade, charging against the weakened line of the enemy across the railroad and into the woods in front, while the 1st Brigade, further to the right, making a similar move, penetrated the enemy's line, capturing 200 prisoners. The Pennsylvania Reserves, on the left of Gibbon's division, were equally successful in breaking through the lines of A.P. Hill and throwing them back on those of Early. Reinforcements were needed to hold the advantage we had gained and to press the yielding rebels still more furiously, but reinforcements did not come. The enemy was quick to see the delay and, massing his forces at the threatened point, compelled us to abandon the ground so dearly bought, and that we ought to have held secure.
Eventually there's a brief hand-to-hand fight where they're actually throwing spears, which with rifles with the bayonets, of course. So we do actually have written incidents of them using these rifles as spears in this hand-to-hand fight that takes place on the railroad here. And one of the surgeons from Gibbon's men writes about treating more bayonet wounds here at Fredericksburg than any other battle he's ever fought in. So to explain a little bit about the courage here that's exhibited by many of the forces fighting, specifically with John Gibbon, there are 2 Union troops, both from different nationalities. One's from England, one from Georgia. Both will actually take flags that have fallen, and there is a Confederate who is being passed multiple rifles and targeting flag bearers left and right. So men on his side are just passing him loaded rifles, and he's taking out flag bearers left and right. And with all that happening, even though that these men see that, 2 different nationalities, we have a German and we have an English soldier, grab the colors and go forward even farther in advance in their battle lines to try and inspire some of the troops to move closer to this railroad and seize it and take the Confederates that are on there and move them back to try and successfully break the lines here. And we're seeing just mass amounts of carnage happening here. We've seen 2 lines fail to actually reach the length of the railroad and have retreated back to the position we're standing in now and even further beyond. But just to highlight those 2 there is some extreme valor and courage just shown here in this vicinity. In fact, this whole entire battlefield, where we know 5 separate Medal of Honors are awarded here on the field. Again, this is a very important part of the Battle of Fredericksburg's history. We see a lot of the stuff at the Sunken Road and Stone Wall that are very, courageous and just horrific to listen to. But here again, where you have that deciding factor of the battle really beginning to shape, to see that act of courage from those 2 men is truly inspiring, and it led some of the troops to actually move forward and break through that line of James Lane's North Carolinians here on the railroad. When we get further down, I'd like to go into detail a little more about what happens when it's broken through.
The ground here rolls and provides concealment for the advancing troops, as my colleague explains.
So we mentioned also the terrain, how it changes, and when we started our walk, it was very flat, it was very kind of a level surface, or so it seems. If you look behind me, there is nothing flat and regular and level about it. It's very undulating, the terrain drops and rises and turns into ditches all over the place, and that adds to some of the confusion of the fighting that takes place here on the Battle of Fredericksburg. When you're moving a line of men and trying to assault a specific location, the one thing you like to have on your side is level ground. It's an easier maneuver. Here, not so much, because you rise up on a piece of ground, you're at level with the Confederates who can fire on you while you're still moving and to get into position to fight them. So one thing that we love to point out when we give tours or we walk around battlefields, and specifically here at Slaughter Pen, is that it's a very deceptive battlefield starting in our parking lot and then moving off towards the railroad when you get to this position. Because you turn around and you're looking at a whole different part of the battlefield that you probably didn't know existed until you reached this part. So many visitors don't take the opportunity to walk all the way around the battlefield and get this vicinity and get this view shed, which I highly recommend. If you ever make it out to Slaughter Pen Farm, definitely do the entirety of the walk so that you can really get a feel for the true nature of the Battle of Fredericksburg.
As you can see, the area is swampy, and I can see why Confederate General A.P. Hill may have left this area lightly defended. I mean, who would charge through this mess? General Hill later wrote of the day.
Concentrating their columns of attack, the enemy now made a bold effort, and pushing onward turned Lane's right, although obstinately resisted by the 28th and the 37th North Carolina regiments. Colonel Barber of the 37th, finding his right turned, changed front with his 3 right companies and poured in a destructive fire. These 2 regiments continued to fight until their ammunition was exhausted, and then were quietly and steadily retired from the field, refilling their boxes and rejoining their brigade. The three remaining regiments of Lane's brigade, 7th, 18th, and 33rd North Carolina, steadily continued to battle against overwhelming numbers, and the attack was checked by well-directed volleys from the 33rd Regiment. General Thomas, responding to the call of General Lane, rapidly threw forward his brigade of Georgians by the flank, and deploying by successive formations, squarely met the enemy, charged them, and joined by the 7th and part of the 18th North Carolina, drove them back with tremendous loss to their original position. General Early, to whom I had sent, requesting that he would move down to my support, came crashing through the woods at the double quick. The enemy, completely broken, fled in confusion.
So now we're standing on Prospect Hill, or as Confederates will dub it later, Dead Horse Hill. That comes from the onslaught of Union shells that are going to pour over this position, landing in the rear, landing on some of the limber chests here on this position as well. This was significant when it came to the artillery duel that was mentioned at Slaughter Pen Farm. There were constant artillery barrages back and forth, and there's an instance here where Willie Pegram is in command of a battery, and the artillery becomes so intense at this location that his men will abandon the two guns and go and seek cover in the woods in some relative safety. Willie Pegram is aghast at this and doesn't really quite understand why his men would abandon the pieces, even though, logic speaking, when you have shells and artillery pieces just raining down on you as they were, it might cause some fright and probably a sought-after piece of shelter. Well, seeking to shame his men back into command and back into manning these pieces, Willie Pegram will strip down the flag of his colors for his battery, and he'll wrap them around himself in a shawl or similar to a toga, and will pace back and forth on these guns until his men come forward and reman the pieces and continue lobbing shells out into the Union positions, which are over near Slaughter Pen Farm. Just off in the distance, over here across the railroad tracks, you're going to see a pyramid that was not actually put here by the Park Service, but was put in place by the CSX Railroad in the early 1900s to commemorate the Battle of Fredericksburg and invite tourists that were on the train to just have a moment and to commemorate the battlefield. But coincidentally, it marks the exact location of where Meade's men will break through into the Finger of Woods, launching that assault onto Maxcy Gregg's unsuspecting Confederate forces, who were charged with that 600-yard gap that was just kind of left unattended. This, again, was the most opportune chance the Union had here at the battle. It was lost due to a failure to communicate and a failure to have reinforcements brought up on Meade's behalf, and the Confederates were able to reinforce their positions, and Jackson was even able to launch a counter-assault at twilight, just towards the close of the dusk, when the battle was closing out. Jackson is able to fortify this position and ultimately gain the success that led to the victory of the Battle of Fredericksburg being in Confederate hands. And one of the greatest locations on this battlefield to come visualize what it was like and just really get a feel for this place. You see the lunettes that are lining the heights behind me here. Those are where the cannons had some relative safety. They're shaped just like crescents, just like a moon, and would serve the artillery some safety during this battle. Today there's still here visible reminders of the battle that took place, scarring the landscape in many different parts of our parks here. But just around you here, you have multiple instances of that, and I think it does take some great service to come here and stand and memorize all of this, and to see the fields that the Union Army charged across to get at these Confederates here that we're able to hold.
As the Confederates pushed the Union wave back, so ended the high point of the battle. No other Union troops on the battlefield would come as close to accomplishing what the First Corps had done. Now, I hope this part of the battle is no longer forgotten. It was a pleasure to share this bit of untold Civil War with you. I hope you tune in next time to our next episode, where I will be fighting a Civil War battle on tabletop with dice and lead soldiers. See how I fare as compared to the generals who sat in the saddle back in the 1860s.